Bum. Hello everyone, right then. Well, we might be a little bit surprised, but the first videos of the year, this is from last week. Well, it'll be, when this comes out, it'll be last week, because of the delays I had the week after I did this, and the issues I had with various family members getting ill, was this video, and the live and long patrol. So, I'm going to answer the comments, well, discuss the comments from this video. Starting off with Inns Morrison. Let me get it straight. So in this scenario, the Germans plan to avoid a war with the UK by invading Belgium, is to launch an amphibious invasion of France through the English Channel. Actually, no, that's not the first. It hadn't. It scrolled down further. Goodness gracious me, I thought I got reached a bomber hand. So sorry, Inns. It's not going to be you first. Richards. Sorry, Mr. Live. Steve Clark. Me too, but it's more that Thursday for me are normally taken. I'm sorry to hear that. Perhaps you'll catch a live someday. I hope you still enjoy the videos. Come Sausage. In the no channel battle scenario, what would stop Germany Copenhagening the French fleet and putting themselves in a strong position against Britain at sea as an insurance for the war to come? The fact the French fleet would fight and was mostly in the Mediterranean would make this difficult. The added problem being not even the French wanted their ships really. Yeah, that's the thing. Copenhagening involves stealing a lot of ships. The British wanted the Danish ships. No one really wanted the French ships. They wanted the French ships which were building, but you can't really do much of them if you don't have the yards to finish them off. And even then, there's normally class battleships. Look, they have a theoretical capability. They do have a theoretical capability. Don't count. One day I will catch a live show. Being an Australian, my shift hours always seem to miss it. Speaking of Daniel, I do hope you catch us when we're down. We're going to be announcements are soon to follow. They might even come out by now, by the point in time actually this video goes live for you all to see. But yes, we are having plannings and things are going to come out, and Australia's going to be cool. Australia, if it happens, is going to be cool. And we are going to be again looking for people once we announce things to sort of do what Stafford etc. did and help be our local ears on the ground and organise dinners for people to come along to if people want to come take part and meet us up, and we're hoping to avoid organised meetings and all sorts of things. So hopefully you'll all enjoy it. It'll all be good. Right then we have Todd Webb. Okay, here's a real plot twist. What if France decided to invade Belgium instead of Germany doing? Does the UK honour its treaty to Belgium and go to war against France and end up in the Central Powers, even though they expected to be fighting them, or do they decide to stuff the treaty with going aside the French anyway and betray Belgium? Let's put it this way. The French were so worried about perfidious Albion, in this regard, they didn't even have a plan to do this, focusing on reinforcing Belgium if Germany invaded. Todd Webb. I'm not saying that my what if is likely, just the biggest spanner in the gears. It would have caused fun, and the British would quite possibly have broken the Entente over it, actually allying with Germany. Unlikely, but not impossible. And I would add to my own comment on that point. The British had been in alliance talks with Germany as late as the early 1900s. So yeah, not that long ago. Todd Webb, if Britain chose betray Belgium and help France invade option, I don't think that would have played out well with neutrals, US or British allies. After Britain betrayed a different ally, Japan. Again, Todd, Belgium wasn't an ally. Britain was a guarantor of their independence on a treaty signed by many powers, including France, Austria, and Prussia from memory. From memory, I have checked this up. Yes, that's what they. Not sort of an alliance, they're a guarantor of their independence. Britain could claim that two powers with far larger armies were already fighting the good fight, and they weren't getting involved so that they could keep them honest when it ended. Basically, that's my point. Is if France invaded and Germany and Austria still attacked France, then Britain could basically say, we're going to stay independent and keep it act as a guarantor to guarantee that the Germans deliver on their promise of restore Belgium independence after this is over. That's sort of, broadly speaking, what I think the British would probably do. And probably sell weapons to both sides quite happily. Fisher, 1906, plot armour. I think that's about HMS New Zealand, and as HMS Yes, New Zealand. And I don't know how, though. In that scenario, she's the only surviving and still floating, not i.e. not beached, dreadnought from both fleets that were involved in the battle. I don't know how she does it! Let me get it straight. So in this scenario, the Germany planned to avoid war with the UK by invading Belgium to launch an amphibious invasion of France through the English Channel. Wouldn't an amphibious invasion of France be virtually indistinguishable from an invasion of the UK until the troops were actually landing? Diplomatic signalling is my answer, would have to be part of the plan, including messaging probably to effect of, to honour your statements on Belgium, our only option to avoid French forts has been through conducting a British-style amphibious operation. We would politely request you do not interfere. And the alliance is that the assumption is that Kaiser Wilhelm is the sort who would actually believe that that would work. Or believe that the British would accept his word. You never know. Fight for a global First Amendment. Was there any chance at any point that either Britain and or Germany could have convinced France to break the Franco-Russian alliance, if both offered mutual defence pacts in the case of one or the other attacking France? Britain was threatened by Russia, Germany was threatened by Russia, France was threatened by Germany. Fix the latter and the former two are more possible. The trouble is it's the legacy of the Franco-Prussian War, and as Glenn McGillivray replies, France remembers the wars, and if you get a non-aggression pact with Germany, who would France invade if they got excitable? Italy? That is the point. James Morrison, I have other questions. What happens if the German liner fleet is on the wrong side of the Atlantic in the run-up for war? What happens if the British or the French notice the German line is being moved to Kiel and it tips them off? What happens if the landings are botched? What happens if the French ports are damaged and the Germans can't land supplies? What happens if the Royal Navy tries to intercept the mission? Answer this in a video, but the Germans don't know. What happens if the Royal Navy attacks the supply convoys and the reinforcements don't get through? What happens if any of the 100 or so things that go wrong in this plan do? That sounds like the list for any amphibious operation. That's the standard thing. You know, you have to go through these. And I wasn't doing the full in-depth operation. If you want me to do a full in-depth operational plan, that's a whole nother and far longer video. I was trying to answer the what if. My response was, hundreds of things can go wrong with any plan. The fleet was so large, there were always a number on the right side or heading the right side of the Atlantic. So that is what you had to work with. Plus, I would add, but I'll say, if you consider the extra infrastructure and things they developed for the Schlieffen plan, if this had been their Schlieffen plan, had been an amphibious operation, they'd have developed stuff for that, and probably including more liners. Amos Morrison, fundamentally, the big problem is that there is no way for the British to tell the Germans aren't invading them. So the Royal Navy must assume that Germans are. It's guaranteed to be war, because if the German plan was to knock out the British in a surprise attack, then it would look identical. Agreed, for the purposes of the question, I had to figure out a way for them not to invade Belgium, but get the same end result, the French army. Plus, I have the advantage that Kaiser Wilhelm is just egotistical enough to believe that a personal message from him to the king will assuage British fears and make it viable. This is also the reason why I said that if the British government for some reason did decide not to do anything, they would fall quickly. And whilst I agree it is unlikely and small, there is still a chance they don't do anything, or they try diplomacy and it takes too long. Thank you for saying it's fair enough, Ins Morrison, that response. Basically, the whole thing is, Germany can do this operation. If they had put their plans into an amphibious operation rather than going through Belgium, deciding they didn't want to risk British neutrality, and using their navy to secure that, and diplomatically signalling the British exactly what they were doing to tell them, that puts the British in a difficult position, because technically the Britain's casus belli, the thing that allows us to go to war, because remember, the Entente is not an alliance. The Entente is not an alliance. It has a lot of forms of alliance. It ends up becoming a functioning alliance, but it isn't an alliance in its wording. That does mean that they can, to an extent, get out of it if they want to. And they could therefore avoid getting into war if they didn't want to. If the Germans, Glenn McClivey, if the Germans go toward France and they build an invasion force, Britain would have kittens, particularly as they advance to the Channel. I expect the Navy would be ordered to prevent landings in Britain, and the High Seas Fleet would be ordered to attack from the rear. The Channel would be a battlefield before the end of the day, with reinforcements from British arriving from every port in the country to defend the home islands. So Germany resupply the French landings would be cut, unless they explicitly asked British permission to transport their entire fleet through the Channel, which seems unlikely. Although, if they just stalled the French, and dug in at the Belgian border and Netherlands, presumably they didn't ask for permission to establish defensive lines when either, France would attempt to break the stalemate by flanking the German lines through Belgium, and that would make Britain very upset. Perhaps not enough for an alliance, but enough to permit a retaliation in the French forts. Really, you think the Kaiser wouldn't believe that the king would listen and accept his request? Trusting his honour that it was not made for Britain of being able to control the government, even with its very different constitutional settlement, as he does in Germany? Glenn McCovey, I had another thought, a minor end. But if France violated Belgian neutrality, I had the thought that maybe the British perspective on offering permission to punish the French military might shift, even if British soldiers and naval assets are all very carefully not getting involved and focusing on protecting their borders. It's complicated. Glenn McClivey, also, hypothesis. Harpoon application was designed by a programmer trying to calculate how many trips it would have taken to sink HMS New Zealand, and accurately models its absence and raw luck in fleet engagements. Hence a survival regardless of circumstances with the full ablative high sea fleet. Honestly, the scenario is that I ran through Harpoon and the one she was only a survivor in. Basically, because she fell into being the aft in-line ship of the battle cruisers, some liners from the attack tried to sort of break off. She went hunting them down, then came in. All the things that were left were so battered that it didn't really take much damage, and not much damage from her, because they didn't really have long-range fire capacity anymore. And actually, this goes back to, she can do the long-range fire because she still has her fire directors, which is why she survived. She basically escapes that battle almost with no damage at all, because nothing she fights can actually fight back, really. Gigo, wouldn't the German Hindenburg battlecruisers, the Badens, Mackensen still be building out to a channel battle scenario? Yep, but they're not going to be available soon enough in enough numbers to stop what happens next, especially with that much of the army gone as well. Ron Steven, great show. Please do more alternative history scenarios. I go where the patrons go in terms of questions. Mrs. EZ, what about Livonians and Retharians and Kazaroons? Try to list straight. Listing all the various different powers moving through Germany. There are lots of them, and frankly, yeah, I'm not going to go through down the whole list, because I think there was also a Mongolian family at one point. Just so many people did it. Josh White, many people say that the outbreak of World War I is the most complicated event in recorded history. I'm impressed with your ability to form these scenarios out of it. Thank you, analyse them. Also curious, what are your thoughts on the work of Johnston Media and Nicholas Lambert? Their deep research on the Orient this time suggested it was a lot less concerned about the German Navy than is often believed. They showed that budget constraints and inter-service manoeuvring played just as much, if not more, a role in shaping our moves as an external threat. My response to that was, it was ever so. There is never enough money to do all the politicians want with what they are prepared to pay. And then Anouk, last comment on the live. Moltke kept altering the Schlieffen plan by pulling more and more troops for the Russian front. Yeah, he was worried about the Russian upgrades in terms of their ability to mobilize. What he really should have done, and I often do think he should have done, is actually build a whole new plan entirely. Because at a certain point, the basics for the Schlieffen plan that were worked out by Schlieffen no longer work. So you need to come up with a new plan, the Moltke plan. But he didn't. Instead, he wanted to keep trying and fiddling with another plan, which would be designed for a completely different scenario. So, now back to the recorded video, the Long Patrol. And, there are comments on this one. There are some really interesting comments, and there are some comments which I'm less enamored with. Rob Land's first comment. I love the fact that you've done that, but question? These notes. In real life, Belgium was supposed to extend the Maginot Line into their country, but ultimately decided against it due to both costs and fear that it would be seen as a violation of neutrality. The French weren't too worried because in World War I had shown that Belgium was at least enough of a speed bump they were able to prevent the German army from reaching Paris. And that increasing mechanisation of the French army, in comparison to their far less mobile German army, would enable them to reach the important river lines in Belgium first, which they were correct about. The French and the British did manage to reach the defensive lines they were supposed to reach. The issue was that the Ardennes had been left defended by too small a force, and under the charge of a general whose initial reaction to the German advance was to immediately retreat rather than engage in delaying actions that would have provided the time necessary for reinforcements to arrive. Trying to extend the Maginot Line along the French border has the big problem of being no truly defensive terrain in northern France. There is no Rhine River or Vosges Mountains like in eastern France. You absolutely need the Ardennes Forest and the Belgian rivers to make a cohesive defensive line without obvious weaknesses, which is also a big reason why 19th century France under Napoleon, the first and the worst, was obsessed with a border on the Rhine. Force 1. If the French stuck with the original Escaut plan, then the sickle cut would very likely have been blunted and stopped by the French 7th Army. And then Kurt over. Force 1. There is a long what if on the initial internet in real life called blunted sickle or something similar that pretty much starts with the French defending one river line further back. Things go complicated from there and produce a much different World War II scenario. It leads to France not collapsing and surrendering 1940. The point I would make is, I don't think you necessarily need the Maginot Line like you build up the Maginot Line on their border with Germany. But I do think you need a series of artillery forts, and I do think you need a series of blocking points built along. And you can make blocking points out of road junctions and all sorts, and river crossings and bridges, but even if you don't have those things, you can make blocking points quite easily. And by blocking points, I mean a few easily defended pillboxes. Something which is not going to be able to be driven through quickly, and which is going to provide a handful of defenders the ability to hold off a larger force for a while. And also positions which troops aren't going to want to abandon because they're going to think they're safe. So they're going to hold them, and even if a general starts saying, "Retreat, I'm running away," they might well go, "Well, you run away, we don't want to be out in the open under air attack, so we'll stay here in a nice thick concrete bunker, thank you very much." So you need something. You need something. If you're going to actually go to the trouble of building these things, you need to build them properly. Leslie Mitchell, book, T-shirt, and mouse mat all purchased. Thank you. I'd hear it. I'd like to hear what the mouse mat looks like. I haven't got one of those yet. Knight 6831. Yeah. Do they run and let the convoy be slaughtered by the British battlecruisers and escorts, or fight to allow the convoy to escape, hoping another force of British ships don't ambush them, or the British Royal Navy submarine force doesn't find a convoy? Well, Ken Maguire's response was both sides would be bringing in submarines to ambush the enemy. Germany would be hoping that they can make the most cost expensive to UK to intervene, but if they're willing or feel forced to, it would be a bloodbath for the UK as the victor. I would say you would be surprised about that. Okay, on the submarine front, because both sides would probably want to bring the submarines in to take part, but the Germans would have to launch their submarines in advance because they're going to be much slower. Even on the surface, they're going to be much slower than they need to go. And the thing is, that would then could give away your plan of attack in your operation, your submarines actually going and getting a position. And that could lead to an incident which could cause you problems. So it's a problem. If you don't forward deploy your submarines, they're not going to be there in time to actually be helping you to fight. If you do, you're going to be running a major risk for your operational security. It's a problem, and it's something I specifically avoided because that would be an entirely different discussion than we were already having. We were already having an interesting one as it was. Also, the Serre River system did have a very deliberate gap between Epinal and Toul, designed to funnel the German army into an awkward position between Epinal, Toul, and Langres. I'll need to check my La Murale de France, but in real life, a gap on the north was always intended by the CDF to enable offensive action by the army. Chapet. What's a good debate about Belgium? I often think, what would the world have been had the Kaiser say, oops, fallen and broken his neck, and his younger brother been a successor in around 1890 or so? His younger brother was a far smarter, far more capable individual. He was a naval officer. He was not a fan of Tirpitz. He was not a fan of Russia, but he had a good enough contacts with France, thanks to his being an admiral and his actual relations, that he could have repaired the Franco-German relationship to the point at which there wouldn't have been the Franco-Russian alliance, and then there could have been a very different matter. Thank you, Trebet. Shulmac, those races are about seeing who has the biggest boat as much as anything else. The US in the 1910s was never going to invade Britain. The army was a joke, and the navy only really had prestige assets. Italy is likewise in that they were never going to invade the UK. The only countries that could have really invaded the UK were France and Germany. France's navy was in the corner eating paint chips and drinking glue at this point. Yeah, I don't quite agree with the description because I think that's a bit mean on the French, but there is there is certainly an argument to be made up with some of their designs. Now, so that only really leaves it to Germans, who are kind of making noises similar to it, so Britain had to define its policy around it. I can see Italy threatening British naval interests in the Mediterranean, primarily the Suez Canal, but I don't see the Italians wanting to push it to the point of war. What would they gain? A rather large empire being annoyed with them. Okay. Ooh, good lord. Suggestion. I'm sorry, this is nonsensical. The Germans would never attempt this in the first place, but even if they lose their wits and do, how many ocean liners does it take to transfer a single army? How long would it take to disembark them? How many ports would, or rather, could they even take? How much time would they have before the French send their reinforcements? They don't have in Germany or even from themselves. How many of those liners could they even try and disembark at the same time? How would they supply the ever-growing number of troops? How the heck would they transfer the big-ass machine guns, let alone even the light artillery? The absurd amount of ammunition, food, all the supplies. While also somehow fending off the French Navy in its attempts at disrupting the conveyor belt. Even putting, say, a whole regiment on a liner would take at least a better part of a day, and they have a quite limited amount of ports to do so. Okay, let's point out this again. The Germans, along with having the largest lines, also have some very, very advanced and very heavily worked out liner ports. But saying that again, if this is your version of the Schieffelin plan you're going with is an amphibious operation, I wouldn't be surprised if you'd built up a few things to make this make it more effective. I.e., just as you built railway lines and railway stations to support the Schlieffen plan, you probably modify your ports and enhance them so you could load and offload liners a lot quicker. Probably also pay to your liner designers, pay your liner companies to make sure their ships are able to self-offload quite easily as well. Then there's a question of said troops being completely isolated for an extended period of time from other theatres, so risking this would mean they couldn't be seen elsewhere against the French or Russians, or if anything goes sideways. Well, again, the whole plan for them being in Belgium going through, they were planning on the French actually attacking into Germany, and the Schlieffen plan was drawn up originally with the idea that the Russians were going to take months to basically mobilize. So that wouldn't have been a factor to any original planning, and as time went on, Moltke would probably have adapted and moved troops over to the Russian front as he did in the real life. And to risk all that, instead of just deciding to defend against the French, which we know would have been successful, given how overpowered the defence was, not realised until World War I began, so that's basically hindsight, and beat back the Russians and help the Australians not wreck themselves and become useless and offensive, then turn west and deal with the French, or even using the ocean liners to send a couple of thousand or even 10,000 troops to French colonies, making them sue for peace in fear of losing their colonies or having to deal with the locals armed by Germans. I think you're forgetting the question. The question I was asked was this, not to redesign the entire German war plan of World War One. I wouldn't go with the Schlieffen plan. If I was designing the German war plan of World War One, I would not A, be building the high seas fleet. B, I would be planning on pretty much doing a defensive, like you said, for the French, letting them wear themselves out on defensive, keeping Belgium, etc., neutral and not invading or touching them at all. Probably my intention would be to let the French in and try and funnel them away from the Ruhr as much as I could, but I don't want them to get anywhere near the Ruhr, so possibly I turn my border into a fortified nightmare and actually just keep pummeling them at the border. And deal with the Russians, and then once I've dealt with the Russians, as I haven't got the high seas fleet, call on my probable ally, Britain at this point, to transport my army and drop me off the coast of France, because I do like an amphibious operation, and I don't want to go through Belgium, which will divide the British loyalties. But with the Royal Navy backing me up, yeah, I can probably beat up the French. Effectively, this scenario assumes that Germany still picks France first strategy, but will not go for Belgium. Yes, it's an insane gamble, but presumably the preparation for this plan takes takes the place of the historical Schlieffen plan. The issue of the land defensive plan is that it's not that it is possible for the attacking army to take ground in World War One as long as defence in depth trench works are not in place, and so the French attack into Alsace-Lorraine would likely push into the German industrial heartland. Adamant, agreed. An amphibious invasion of France's Channel coast would have been operationally idiotic. I don't think idiotic. It would be complicated, and I don't think that should. In the nicest way, if we consider some of the amphibious operations which have been done in the world, D-Day, although that really is a large river crossing, but D-Day. If we consider the Falklands, if we consider Operation Torch, Operation Husky, yes, those are World War II. Even Gallipoli, if we think about it, yes, it was badly done and badly coordinated on Gallipoli front, but it all still came. And if it had been better coordinated, if those troops had come in with the first attack by the Navy and the fleet had had some pre-dreadnoughts converted to be basically minesweepers in a very pragmatic way, that might have worked. So, and amphibious operations have a history. There are many powers in this period who have fought amphibious campaigns. The entire Russo-Swedish War had been pretty much one amphibious operation after another. There were a lot of Prussian soldiers who had been part of that on the Swedish side. So, there is a history and a knowledge base included in the strategic discussion. So, I'm not picking out from nowhere. Even without the interference of the Royal Navy, it would have been logistically hard to sustain and would have required an amphibious doctrine which even the British hadn't created yet. The British did have an amphibious doctrine at this point. They didn't actually employ it properly, but they did have a doctrine. Dr. Clark's understanding of military and political matters seems a bit amateurish. It's not really constructive, is it, Adam? It assumes a friendship between Britain and the United States did not exist until well into World War II. And even then, the US deliberately crippled her financially, so the British was no longer sustainable. Adam? Really? Okay, so you're presuming that the Americans are going to suddenly build a fleet, launch across the Atlantic to attack the British if the British lose their ships in a Channel battle. And that's what's got the Americans. Another democracy and a Congress which doesn't want to fund a Navy is going to suddenly do. The Americans, there is a difference between actively wanting to attack your opponent and taking advantage of another nation's weakness. The Americans and British have a relationship where they're quite happy to take advantage of when the other's weak. Doesn't mean they're actively going to go to war with each other. That's just basic national interests and nations acting in their own interests. It's what nations do. Even with the Entente, the British government looked for a way to avoid the war, entering the war. Yes. If the Germans stayed out of Belgium and the Channel, there was a good chance the British would have stayed out of the war militarily and just supported the French economically. Probably, but again, this plan was basically come with a better Schlieffen plan that doesn't involve going through Belgium. Germany's problem was that it needed a short war, and the only way that was going to happen was if they defeated either France or Russia quickly. They did not believe they could defeat Russia quickly because of its vast size, no matter how frequently it beat Russia's armies. However risky the Schlieffen swing through Belgium looked beforehand, and in fact turned out to be, it is at least seemed possible. Looking back, we assume a longer war than anyone thought possible before it happened, and seem to think the Germans foolish for not foreseeing that we know in retrospect. Nope. Everyone thought it was going to be a quick war. Everyone thought wars would be quick because the Franco-Prussian War and other wars had been quick. The point is, the swing through Belgium is not a good idea. And during the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans had realised this and had avoided Belgium like the plague. But after the French construct the forts, that makes that a problem. Whilst I agree an amphibious assault is is the least likely option that Germany could take in theory, or a surprise attack on both France and Britain could knock both countries out of the war in about a week, but it would be a borderline insane death or glory gamble. There is a good reason that the Germans went through Belgium in reality. And honestly, I would argue that yes, this is being the next best option for actually carrying out a Schlieffen plan than going through Belgium. In terms of being actually operationally able to do it, shows the reason you go through Belgium. But that still makes going through Belgium still problematic. In reality, a question that Germans don't do that. However, I think that it would be uncharitable to call the doctor's understanding amateurish. Thank you, Innes. Over a thought experiment. Whilst Anglo-American relations were not as good as they would become, neither were they hostile, and neutrality is good enough under the scenario. Ultimately, the Germans expected a rerun of the Franco-Prussian War and got a new Napoleonic-style war. That a mix. That is okay. It was deliberately uncharitable. If you doubt it was deliberately uncharitable, honestly, Adam, it was a bit rude. When you call someone who does the level of work I do amateurish, it's a bit rude. He might not. I'm not going to take it as being meant as so, but that honestly, when I first read it, I was going, okay. Like, if you doubt it was said it was deserved, then wargame his scenario, like the Germans would have, and I have, and decide if you would do it, even assuming the British would. And that's why there's a link in the description of this video of the Long Patrol to wargaming, history of wargaming for the Germans. If you would do, even assuming the British would do nothing with the German Navy right off the coast. French destroyers or submarines, there aren't that many of them in the channel, could have done a lot, and mines, could have done a lot of damage right off their own coast. Really? Honestly, they'd have been absolutely overwhelmed. As for the French submarine force, again, you are right, the French have very capable submarines. But the French at the beginning of World War One have some issues with those submarines. They refine them and they become very good, but there is a reason so many French submarines get captured by the Austrians and used by the Austrians. More interesting would have been applying himself to what he would do as commander of the High Seas Fleet. That would be a completely different question. What could they do to support the France and without provoking Britain into joining it? Well, if you want to ask that question as a patron, please do ask that question and I'll do it. But the question I was asked was the invasion of Belgium. And I didn't want to do that. If your problem with a video is you don't agree with the question, then I would suggest, if you don't want to, then rather than commenting and being what sounds a bit rude, maybe just don't watch it. There are lots of other videos to go watch. It's up to you. Ian Morrison. The issue to High Sea Fleet is that it is a weapon pointed at Britain, so the Germans actually have very limited options on how to use it, if they want to avoid a war with Britain. It's a problem in that scenario, as well as any preparation for amphibious attack on France, are visually indistinguishable from invasion of Britain, which is why the Germans have to go through Belgium in our timeline. Adam Mintz. First, let go of the idea of launching amphibious invasion of France. Impractical logistically, unnecessary of a land border to cross. No, there's a huge... I seem to remember pointing out there was something else on the land border. What is that on land border? Oh yes, there are all these forts. Land border cross, and historical for the technology at the time. No, there have been amphibious operations. There were amphibious operations conducted. The invasion of Britain in 1066 is an amphibious operation. With this idea that the technology for amphibious operations doesn't exist at any point. You can conduct an amphibious operation. It's not the same as you do it in World War II and not the same as you do it today, but that's still an amphibious operation. Also, the Germans are... if they still wanted to attack France first, the French borders fortified zones were not the Maginot Line. No, they were still pretty capable, though. Also, the Germans and Austrians had developed heavy artillery that were capable of taking the forts out after Schlieffen came up with his plan. Well, I'm surprised. Did the German army not know this? You know, if they have artillery which can take out those forts, I'm sure the German army would have realised this and actually used it. Or can they take it out with the knowledge we have now, looking back in hindsight and doing the maths and going, well, actually, this gun could take it out? German plans for a coup de main against Antwerp by sea looked a lot like the British landing in Gallipoli. They let that idea go because they couldn't make an opposed naval landing work. Secondly, it's very narrow thinking to believe that the German Navy can only be used against Britain. British naval predominance is what made cruiser warfare impractical for Germany historically. Against France and Russia alone, there are more options in the area. They would still be stuck where British shipping is concerned, still trying not to provoke them, but could seize French shipping in the Atlantic. Really? You want to try and seize French shipping in the Atlantic by going round Britain with cruisers and therefore interfering with shipping lanes? And how long before those French companies set up British subsidiaries, transfer their ships over, and have them as British flagged? I mean, that would be like 5 minutes. That's what would probably happen. Especially if Britain is economically supplying and supporting the French, thanks to the Entente. The British would be quite happily doing convoying, perhaps, of those ships through. And stop and search other neutral shipping approaching French ports using prize rules. Well, that actually plays into the French hands, and there are other issues with that. They could also... Where are they going to be basing from to do this? This is the first question I'd be asking, because for you to sit out, especially if you're a coal-powered ship, oil-powered you can do refueling at sea far more easily. You can't really do refueling at sea with coal-powered ships that efficiently. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to sit out there? You're going to have to be running back and forth through the channel, or are you going around Britain? In which case, think about the distance you're going to go. Go up the North Sea, around Britain, down into the Bay of Biscay. And what happens if the French are just bringing the ships through the Mediterranean to these, through the Strait of Gibraltar to the Mediterranean ports? Where are you going to be operating from? How are you going to be getting to those areas you can do that? They could also run convoys to Americas for food, raw materials, and even munitions as the war ran along. These convoy battles could have been a very interesting discussion. That is a long, vulnerable route. It could balance out France's material inferiority at sea. Oh well, enjoy, opportunity missed. Enjoy the next webcast. No, because that's not really practical. The Germans don't really have ships. They'd have to build an entirely new fleet. You'd have to build a very different fleet to be able to do that. Which is fine, you can do that, but again, that's going to be making... I'm going to be changing the entire German philosophy of war and the entire high seas fleet and everything else from history. So at that point, you're basically starting a question of, you are Germany in 1890, design a force which will eventually fight World War One. And I'll do that, but that wasn't the question of the video. Emrix, do you have any evidence that the US deliberately crippled the UK financially in World War II? I find the allegation to be unsupported. If you have facts to support the allegation, I'd like to hear it. It was a consequence of the Cash of Carry Neutrality Act 1959, prior to the Lend-Lease Act, forced Britain to liquidate its profitable foreign holdings, particularly in the US, and run down its gold reserves by about 5%, I think, to purchase munitions in the US. I read a World at Arms, Weinberg. The public emission of their assets were running out, and the sale of their holdings in the US was part of the deal to get support to pass the Lend-Lease Act. The Act's requirement to purchase any equipment not destroyed or returned post-war was a further drain. The support for, even a 90% discount, the support for Britain in World War II in the US was very broadly popular during World War II, so support for its empire was non-existent. Prior to World War II, there was little separation between Britain and its empire in American minds. This affected operations in Southeast Asia and the Mediterranean during the war. I'm not asserting open hostility towards Britain, yet is actually what you did assertive with your phraseology earlier, if you check it. Before the war was widespread outside the Irish community, but special relation that we all seem to take for granted did not exist yet. The deep ambivalence towards Britain was a real thing. Now, I have another book here, and I've had to get myself a second copy because my other copy has been nicked. Now, this is called The Pilgrim Society and Public Diplomacy, 1895 to 1945 by Stephen Bowman. It's about the often forgotten various conversations going on between British and American diplomats and attempts by Britain to get involved in American politics and to basically have its own society. The thing is, due to the way world wars etc. break out, they don't get as much attention as the pro-German groups or the pro-Irish groups, but they are pretty darn effective, and it's worthwhile reading. I would also say that there have been some discussions which have overstated the level of, how do I put this? They look for what I would call malice, where in fact there is avarice in terms of American dealings. And I would say that the financial thing is one of those. Animus, that's a far cry from deliberately crippling the British economy. Wars have consequences and they cost a lot of money as well as lives. Would you have America cripple its economy to subsidise Britain for the war we were not yet involved in? We twisted the neutrality rules into pretzels to support Britain as it was, which I would agree with. Adam Minsk, I obviously disagree, but that's okay. If you believe the Empire could be sustained without those reserves, no, it couldn't. But honestly, the British weren't planning on sustaining the Empire. The British had been working on decolonising for a century, well, basically since the 1890s by this point, setting up dominions and all this thing. They've been working on decolonising the Empire and turning it into a Commonwealth because that would be financially far more sensible. They wanted it to be a free trade and defence area, where Britain was the dominant partner and everyone else basically followed along, but where Britain didn't have to provide a garrison, didn't have to provide governors, didn't have to provide the administration of all these countries. If you believe the Empire could be sustained without its reserves and it was something else that made continuing the Empire impossible, these are arguments to be made for other causes. Now, I've never argued the US should cripple its economy for the British Empire, but I don't believe that was a likely outcome of free aid earlier. I have argued that it was the political price to be paid to win support for the Lend-Lease Act. The US and British Empire were not best buds in 1940, and were much less so in 1914. There's a difference between not being best buds and being actively against each other. Yes, they're both seeking their own advantage, but they're nation states. That's what they do. They act in their own interests. They never, in the nicest way, nations do not have friendships. They have interests. And one of the things I find funniest is the special relationship, which is often touted as this beautiful relationship which doesn't have... No. It works as long as British and American interests coincide, which more often than not they do, so it looks like it is. But when they don't, that gets very acrimonious very quickly, because there is a perception on both sides that there is a special relationship, and it should therefore, the British should always follow the Americans, or the Americans should always back up the British. But they don't. They don't. And it's only really surface talk of a special relationship. It's interests. That completely changed in 1940 by 1945, but even then it took the start of the Cold War to bring financial support from the US to the countries trying to sustain their colonial empires. Even then it had its limits. And it never came for the British. Didn't. Bissink. Right then. Yeah, the British Empire could tell America to shut up and shove off, or vice versa from Emmerich. Really, there wasn't much reason for conflict between the two. I really find the fantasy of a war between UK and US rather stretching realms of reality. The point I usually make, and this was my point, is they were a level relationship with tech rivalry. Don't mind it when things go wrong with another to their advantage, but aren't looking for an actual fight with each other, as it gets very messy very quickly. Ribs, I agree. I can see a perhaps strained relationship between the two, but outright war, the US was entering a period of isolationism. That was only partly a result of the horrors of World War I. And why would the UK pick a fight with a rapidly expanding economic juggernaut that was not directly threatening them? We weren't looking to expand into Africa. The UK wasn't looking to expand in the Caribbean or South America. We each had our own spheres of influence out down there. The only potential conflict I could see would be in China, and it seems our interest there was mutual. As a rule, it was, and this is one of the things. The British and British-American special relationship, as we now think of it, was born of mutual interest. It wasn't born of some kind of love for each other or love affair. That's often some people bring up. Oh, good lord, it really wasn't. It was born from mutual interests. And that's the thing is, you could argue to an extent America's position often with Britain has been to get involved and back up Britain and supply Britain with money in World War One and World War Two, so they don't have to get involved later. Because for the Americans in World War One, there's a view that if the continental powers win, the world order as they know it would disintegrate. Because if Britain and France both collapsed, due to losing a war, due to losing World War One. If that had happened, and it wasn't likely to happen, but France collapsing was a big worry for them by 1917, and that certainly motivated them. They didn't think Britain was going to collapse. Britain was certainly not enjoying itself, and was economically there were problems, but it wasn't overstretched at that point. One of the things I often point out to people is that it's not the First World War which breaks Britain economically. It's the First World War, the Depression, and then the Second World War. It could have taken any one of those three. It could probably have weathered any two, but all three combined are what sucker punched the British economy. And the trouble is, sometimes our perceptions, especially this comes back to when people going after World War One, go, "Oh, the British couldn't afford to build more capital ships or keep building capital ships or anything like that." They could afford it. They chose to pay down the debt faster than they had to prepare their economy better, which did help in the Depression, but honestly helped as well in World War Two. But they could have a little bit, but not much. But the thing is, they are doing okay, and especially if you read the Cambridge British Historical Statistics book, you'll find the British economy is doing okay after World War One. They're even bouncing back after the Depression. But then comes World War Two, and you can't keep taking a plunge and then bounce back, because they're sort of doing there's World War. They're sort of this economy. World War One comes, boom, and then they're up here, and then the Depression starts, boom, and then they're up sort of here, and then World War Two comes, oh, down they're gone, and that's it. It's the stake for most empires, if we consider most major empires that have fallen, have often been hit by major wars and economic disturbances in quick succession. You can weather a major war. You can weather a major economic depression. You can't weather two major wars and a major economic depression. You can't. It's gonna do too much damage. Christopher, read the first alliance. Hasn't England and Portugal had an alliance, a perpetual alliance predating the Napoleonic War? England, not Britain, and that's a whole another kettle of fish. Christopher, as an American, I always forget English, British, UK are not always synonyms. Damien, what do you think was one of the reasons why Portugal came into World War One? They were an alliance from 1386. Why did the Allies get basic rights as wars later in World War Two? They had the alliance from 1836. Then my response to David Newton. Let's put it this way: alliances like that are medieval structural alliances. The Anglo-Japanese alliance was a modern structural alliance. At some point, I'm going to have to do an international relations crib video for military history types. It was well done. It would also be argued that although Portugal and UK do have an alliance at the time, following on from the Napoleonic Wars, this isn't something which is in writing, other than document mentioned that Portugal in 1914 cannot be considered one of the great powers of the day. The Anglo-Japanese alliance is a departure because Britain is allying itself with another great power, or one on the cusp of becoming one, so is leaving its previous so-called isolationist period. Although both British and American periods of isolationism involve other countries active on the world stage, a lot more than the traditional history because the amount of investment overseas and soft power wielded by both countries. David, by that do you mean dynastic rather than nation-based? David, to an extent, but also in terms of phraseology and context, there are differences, some subtle, some obscene. Basically, what I mean by subtle is some changes are so close that, frankly, to modern terminology, they're like that. But some are massively different. Christopher, by medieval structures, that it's primary alliance between the persons of the signing monarchs and their houses and successors, and only secondary agreement between a nation, those monarchs rule, and only then do their status in their king's personal property via divine right. Yeah, there are all sorts of interesting things. There's also the fact that I would argue any alliance where it's been around so long you've actually lost the documents which the alliance are written on, so you have to ask the other party for their copy of the alliance so you can find out what it entitles you to, is not really the strongest alliance. Just a small point. Here's Morrison. Probably the British building something like the N3s, where the new battleships are subdivided to survive extreme close-range fire. At the same time, naval doctrine probably changes to either a death or glory lionization of a close-quarters battle, or prepare for the worst, but never again, if we can help it, focus on long-range fire. My guessing would be the latter one, especially after the battle which ended up with the one scenario where New Zealand ended up winning and surviving on their own. The big change is no anti-submarine warfare doctrine until at least the 1920s, although a quick war where everyone dies in a horrible battle in the Channel may have fewer overall lives lost than in historical timeline, a living or dead Jellicoe's New Nelson. Christopher, Jellicoe dies winning the Battle of the Channel, guaranteed he's remembered as New Nelson. The parallels are too easy for the press to draw for them not to. It's a shorter range battle of the Channel occurs. I think a gun count and a speed are emphasised as future designs, with calibre and armour becoming of secondary concern. At ranges closer to Trafalgar than Tsushima, armour becomes impractical. The thickness required to keep 15 or even 13.5-inch guns fire out becomes prohibitive. So perhaps the way forward to the fast battleships to fight inevitably the second 20th century war, perhaps another American attempt to take Canada in 30s or 40s, is from the battlecruiser, not the dreadnought. No, I'd say the next major war would probably be... Well, let's see. Russia survives virtually intact. Or after this one would be an Anglo-Russian war. Yeah, that probably shocked you. After all, the Royal Navy's going to have to be rapidly rebuilt, etc. And they will be. But it would be an Anglo-Russian war over probably India. Because there have already been issues. Or there will be another Russo-Japanese war. Because Russia's strategic philosophy, and there was another gentleman who said this the other day, and it was on, I think it was on the Joe Rogan show. And I was sent the clip and went, yeah, that's what I said at the conference. Russia has had a defensive philosophy which has been the same for several hundred years. Expand to points of geographical control at which they can secure their borders. That's been the Russian Russian strategic philosophy for since about the time since probably before the times of Napoleon, and it will ever be so until they have a massive cultural change and they no longer perceive the world as very, very scary and threatening. Macho Dostral. I think they will get influenced by the battle and start to build ships with better protection and damage control, partly also from the study of the wrecks. This may mean much heavier split between battleships, which would move closer to coastal battleship form, and battle cruisers, which would split into first and second class ships, first being more of a fast battleship and the second being large armoured cruisers for lower threat environments. So it doesn't make much sense. My point is that they would build much heavier after the battle. I can see where you're coming from. I think they would... My instinct is they would build faster so they wouldn't have such a close quarters combat again. So I think it would be a fusing of the Dreadnought and the battlecruiser line into a fast battleship design. And a larger cruiser come about. Might even call it a frigate. Some kind of... Or maybe the they keep it as the battlecruiser, but which would be an even faster vessel, but with less guns. Kevin Guan, an interesting scenario. I doubt that Moltke would have gone for it, while the German-Prussian military tradition was into aggressive moves, while Moltke's modifications to German war plans were to make them more logistically solid instead of bold moves like this. In a medium sea power, that wasn't natural to them. I can see your point, but again, if Schlieffen has come up with this plan, Moltke shows that... Let's see, what Moltke should have done is take the Schlieffen plan and go in. And rewritten an entire new plan, based on the strategic realities that he faced in the 1910s. But he didn't do that. So if this had been the Schlieffen plan, he'd have modified it, not rewritten it. As to your official question, what would the UK build after this glorious victory? They have just seen the value of their navy, so yes, they would have a rebuilding program. First, I see them churning out R's, a way to get numbers up. R, some form of updated R class, would be backed by a new battle line, quite an upgrade from what they had at the beginning of 1914. I'd say probably a Queen Elizabeth, actually, and the second batch of Queen Elizabeths. I'd probably see it as a fusion of the Queen Elizabeth speed and the R-Class um, new armour scheme, and size of the Queen Elizabeth to allow for modification upgrade. But with the continued technical rivalry of the USA and Italy, I see them developing their 18-inch guns. This would be, or maybe the 16.5-inch guns. This would be combined with the major modern boilers to come up with a status ship that would raise the bar over the 16-inch guns, already being talked about. The UK would hope that all rival powers would see this as battles indicating that close-in knife fights were the way the big boys play at sea. But I think the UK leaders, who in the real world decided to not do a close to short blockade of Germany, would design a status ship in both more speed and long-range gunnery than anything else in the world. In addition, instead of any R's being turned into battlecruisers, all 4 Admirals will be built close to the original plan, or probably their equivalents. Obviously, the next generation battlecruiser would somehow bring the 18-inch guns into a battlecruiser, and the main battle line will have some form of class that has the 18-inch guns, but would be a bit cheaper than the full-on prestige battleships. Be quite interesting to see what they come with, but I don't know enough about the design to offer anything specific. I'm tempted to say I think it becomes Queen Elizabeth's modified with the full 28 knot speed, with 12 16.5-inch guns in 4 triple turrets. I would say that would be what I would probably think to build. They keep taking on medium-sized nations, Ukraine, and having a terrible time. My mind doesn't history rhyme. I think that's about Russia. HMS Verdun. I think the British might not design so much around night battles unless the engagement continues in the evening. I expect the British move towards armour more like that on a King George V and potentially towards a more all-nothing fast scheme faster than after analysing where the hits are, if for no other reason than allowing for less armour to be used in shorter dockyards when rebuilding. I think I think they'd have probably invested in larger dockyards as well as part of it. I think the first ones would have been the Queen Elizabeth or R-Class, so they would have been okay, and then they'd have been extending the dockyards as fast as they could. I think long or short range, the British continue to go for heavy guns after they prove themselves in battle. Without a potential quantitative build challenge from the Germans, you might see classes of 3 or 4 instead of 5 or 6. So you have a quantitative advantage over other navies, 2 to 3 ships a year for cost reasons, given how much they would be. I think they might go well. Have an opportunity to build a new fleet. So the 27 to 28 knot fast battleship Queen Elizabeth Mark IIs get built. Where I'm not sure is the guns. As Britain is going to be in a tech race, I think whatever Agincourt was going to mount will be the new paradigm. This could be 12 15-inch guns in triples, or it could be 18-inch guns. I'm not sure what battlecruisers would be. If you have 12 triple 15s on a battleship, or 8 18-inch on guns on it could be a mini Iowa, with 9 15-inch guns or 6 18-inch gun ships. The generation after that is truly scary. Potentially something like Yamato size or bigger, fast super duper Delnor with 18-inch guns so it can fit into an existing dockyard. Potentially this knocks naval aviation back 10 or 15 years as everyone scrambles to build bigger, faster battleships. Without the treaty system, instead of investing in aircraft carriers until engine-on planes reach a point that they can drop big enough torpedoes to be worth it. I don't know who the admirals or the future are. It depends on who of Somerville, Henderson, Tovey, Fisher, Fraser, Ramsey, V, and X survive, which might still depend on where they are posted at the time. Cunningham, who I know was in the Med, will depend on whether or not him fighting in the battle, unless Goeben is fought in this timeline, and he survives, counts against them or not. But his general competence would likely be welcome, I suspect. The other thing is that potentially the royal family has changed massively, as if King George VI might not make it given his posting at the time was the 12-inch general. That is an interesting scenario. Yeah, there could be a very, very big... But then there's another scenario that goes on. With his brother dead, Prince Edward probably gets pushed into marrying someone very quickly. He might well get ordered to marry someone very quickly. The sheer losses. It would change the world to an extent. Adam Minsk. Why do Dr. Clarke's hypothetical scenarios sound like pre-World War I invasion stories where Britain enemies do something incredibly foolish to play to the Royal Navy's strengths and get smashed in a ground battle? See, even the Martians took one on the chin when they didn't take the Royal Navy's Thunderchild seriously. See, earlier, when you wrote, if you'd written you didn't agree with my analysis, instead of amateurish, my response to that would have been entirely different. And I hope you realise that I took this question, and I did respond to you, in that strain of thought. It's phraseology I do pick up on. In this case, because I was trying to come up with a scenario that fitted the requirements of both the question and the operational goals of the Schlieffen Plan. That doesn't leave that many options. As I explained, south, not good. Switzerland, aggressively neutral. Fortified border, not good. Sucking the French into the Ruhr Valley, blowing up German industry, not good. If no Belgium option, then as difficult and problematic as it is, line as amphibious operation down the channel is it. To be honest, if anything, this all serves to illustrate why the Germans chose to go through Belgium and hope the British don't interfere. Good Dr. Clark, Alex Clark, I did think it was coming to you having to do something in the situation, and it would get outrageous. I'm surprised you didn't drop a mention of Riddle of the Sand, since invasion stories were a thing in the early 1900s. I tried not to, because some of them are a bit... I also think the logistics and captured ports requirements of such a German invasion are just too immense. Plus, I don't think the operation could be hidden. Just too easy for the shipping and troop concentrations to be noticed. Adamants, attack the scenario from the German perspective. Try thinking of what the German Navy would do without attacking or directly threatening British interests, in the hope they stay neutral. You know better than most everyone how difficult, well, considering you just called me amateurish earlier, how do I know better? Sorry, that's petty on me. I had a weird week, but yeah. You know better than most everybody how difficult amphibious invasions are and how difficult they are to supply. True, but you do have a very large fleet of ships to call upon. And if you think that you can stop the British won't interfere because you're banking on, the Kaiser's banking on this Prime Minister not being that strong and doing what the King says and the King trusting him, not something that somebody does if they have any other options, except maybe Churchill. Again, in 1914, the Germans had non-naval options for getting at France. None with the prospect of quick victory without the Belgium option, so they would more likely go east with most of the army than bring the NATO Navy into their plans. But that's rearranging the entire plan. I was going with the Schlieffen Plan, because that was how I had to modify it. If you want me, as I've said already in response to your questions, you seem to want me to rewrite the entire German doctrine. I'm happy to do so, but that wasn't the question asked. And that is one of the things with what-if scenarios. If I'm asked a what-if scenario and doing a what-if question, I will try and answer that question. I won't rewrite it to another question. So if you want me to answer a different question, then please ask it as a patron. Now with the prospect of quick victory without Belgium options, so they would likely go east most of the army and then bring the navy into the plans. By the way, historically, the French attacks in Lorraine went nowhere. That's what they were supposed to, but they still had happened. Partly this was because the 6th German Army fought from prepared defensive positions. Yes. Depending on how much of the army was sent east, there wasn't much chance of the French taking the Ruhr, but maybe Alsace-Lorraine. This is assuming historic levels of competence and ability to absorb lessons from combat. The French were good, but there would have been a lot of problems to solve, and the Germans were usually good at all, but as good or better. It's also assuming historical levels of luck. Then my response. The point would be, due to the location of the ports, no one know which way the fleet was going to go. They could be heading for St. Petersburg, so it gives it strategic ambiguity from that perspective. As for logistics, that would be immense, but ships from the world's historically 2 largest commercial liner fleets, which in this scenario would probably have been even bigger, after all, considering the adaptations preparations of railways to the Schlieffen Plan, ships and ports, at least on the German side, would have also had some levels of enhancements. I'd add also probably the actual liners themselves. Honestly, as said in the description, this isn't really a good option. In fact, it makes the case for the Belgium plan, but criteria were to keep as close to the Schlieffen Plan's goals methodology as possible whilst avoiding Belgium. Also, as I think I responded to Paul from Chicago's comment, there is also another option of Germany don't attack France, just stare at them across the border in naval terms, carry out the 1914 version of the Franco-Prussian War and concentrate on beating up the Russians. However, that scenario would completely abandon the Schlieffen Plan, which wasn't an option under the criteria really. And that would actually have been my plan. That would be actually what I would have done. But I'm not the German High Command. And the German High Command do the Schlieffen Plan, which I wouldn't have done. Paul from Chicago. I think I disagree with your premise. At the start of World War I, the Kaiser didn't want to invade France. He wanted to send his troops against Germany. I presume against Russia. Because he was Germany. So I'm presuming that's Russia. Von Moltke argued with passionate about this, and ultimately the Kaiser gave in. But the Kaiser simply could have listed the order and left. Moltke argued the timetables for Russian attack against France didn't exist. But that wasn't for Russian attack against Germany didn't exist. But that wasn't for a German attack against France, didn't Russia? I'm not sure. Didn't exist, but that wasn't entirely true. With a little bit of work on Mock's part, Germany and France might have spent the war staring at each other. I can see where you're coming from, and this is my response, but I felt that a bit of a cop-out question compared to what was asked, so I was trying to come up with a scenario that fitted the requirements of both the question and the operational goals of the Schlieffen Plan, as I felt that was the intent of the questioner, and was, broadly speaking, what they said in their original drafting on the question. That didn't fit in the text block of the questions on Patreon, so I had to modify the question to fit into the text block. That really doesn't leave that many options. As I explained, South not good, fortified border not good, sucking the French in the Ruhr Valley, blowing up German industry not good, and yes, they only get into Lorraine, but historically. But if you are going to turn it into a counterattack position, i.e. you're going to suck them in, then use that as an attack to break through their fortifications on the other side, and then attack France to repeat the strategic attack plan of the Franco-Prussian War, then you need to draw them in deeper to take them out. And that's the problem. But honestly, I think this also illustrates why the Germans chose to go through Belgium and hope the British don't interfere. Although they could also just gone and beaten up the Russians, not invaded Belgium, turned it into a naval war version of the Franco-Prussian War, and started at a stab at the French, all the while feeling that it was the risk fleet which kept Britain out of it, when in fact it was that someone else beating up the Russians would have been doing their work for them. But then the answer for the RN is the naval race continues, until something else happens, and there is a war of UK and France versus Germany. For Chicago, I completely understand. It would make for a somewhat poor, boring video. Your way is much better. That wasn't really the case, but also I was trying to fit it with the German strategic doctrine. As Adam Mitz correctly pointed out, the Germans do have a very, very great emphasis on wargaming and on testing these scenarios out. But the Germans also have a preponderance towards aggressive action. And please note, wargaming doesn't always necessarily develop a great idea, because the Japanese wargame extensively through World War II, and what they did was they just ignored the wargames which showed there were problems in their plans. And when those wargames produced those problems, they rewrote the rules. That is the problem with wargaming. You can take it as information, or you can also ignore it. G.D. Hammond, I believe you have to build for long-range engagements because long-range guns can handle both scenarios, whereas the ship designed for short-range engagements, well, the issue is really more of a fighting doctrine. The Americans built for long range, but did not develop doctrine for Guadalcanal-type engagements, even though the US expected fighting the Japanese fleet in the Western Pacific if it came to war. As far as Lloyd George, I remember as a teenager in church camp doing many impromptu Lloyd George marches through the Lake Michigan and sand dunes, with everyone singing the grand old Lloyd George Knew My Father. Dave Newton, one major thing not covered in this video, Ottomans. Particularly in the scenario with an RN smashing victory in the English Channel, there are some very interesting scenarios with the Ottomans in the aftermath. I strongly suspect that a smashing RN victory would result in the Ottomans not wanting to touch Goeben with a barge pole. So you have a victorious Russia and an intact Ottoman Empire which doesn't end up in the war on Germany's side. What does that suggest to me as next European war? Russians resume their historic quest to go after Constantinople. That suggests UK intervention, like in 1854, if they have a fleet available to intervene. Remember, the British will probably have quite a fair number of pre-dreadnoughts, etc. still around, so they won't be completely empty fleet. And they'll be building other ships. It's one of the two major flashpoints between Russia and UK along with Afghanistan. If the UK doesn't interfere in the conflict, then I'd suggest Russian steamroller might actually work. The Austrians and Ottomans in that era were two powers that were actually weaker and worse than Russia. So Ottomans alone against Russia suggests it's going very badly for the Ottomans, just like 1877 to 1878. The UK does intervene in the conflict, then we can have a much more interesting scenario to consider the outcomes of. Yeah. Martin Peacock, once again, another excellent video. Thank you. But I do realise there are problems with it. In that I think I probably should have done more of an explanation in the beginning of some things, and some of the points, more explanation. But the trouble is, it's getting it all to fit within the time. And I do notice that the longer these videos go over 70 minutes, the less and less people watch to the end. And so that's why I try and keep them as close to 70 minutes as possible. Because, let's put it this way, if I put a 70-minute video out, the average view duration is about 40 minutes. If I put out a 90-minute video, the average view duration is 30 minutes. If I put out a 2-hour video, the average view is 20 minutes. But, conversely, if I put out a 60-minute video, the average view goes down to 20 minutes. 50-minute video, the average view goes down to 10 minutes. So 70 seems to be about the sweet spot. I completely agree with you on the scale of death and destruction should the RN have fought the Kriegsmarine in the Channel. While the French and British sailors would still have suffered losses, they at least had the bonus, as you mentioned, of landing on friendly breaches, which probably means that they actually lose a lot of ships, but maybe not as many lives. The Germans, however, would have been absolutely devastated. Had even a couple of destroyers got amongst the invasion transports, the loss of lives would have been appalling even by World War I standards. In a way, you kind of made me glad World War I played as it did. On the point you made about the Schlieffen Plan, being aware that the RN would likely get involved if Germany invaded Belgium, I think you're possibly more right than you realise there. There are some suggestions that the initial Schlieffen Plan was actually defensive in nature and was relying on the French attacking. The only real place France can attack into Germany is between Metz and Strasbourg, both of which Germany has heavily fortified, though not the ground in between. The suggestion is that the Schlieffen would have given ground in Alsace-Lorraine, draw the French in, then use the strong right-wing attack from Metz to cut behind the advancing French armies and that's around annihilate them. This basic plan was then adapted to the changing political and military situation, and as such, the excluded Schlieffen Plan was actually a heavily bastardized version and warped version. On the type of RN ships the RN would build, I think the first step would be a free improved Queen Elizabeth class. We really need to have some discussion about these, by the way. I really think I'm going onto something there. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first is to get a complete squadron to work with the R's, and the second is to give the RN some time to get things ready for next class of ship. Next class would be 9 improved R's, with I suspected 4 triple 15-inch guns and increased armour. I was thinking 16.5s, like you mentioned, but I think the class would be the last low battleships built. The RN would probably want a nice unified free squadron plus a flagship force, and keeping all the guns the same calibre helps with that. The follow-on will then either be a faster version, faster than QEs as well, or the improved R, with either 4 triple 16.5-inch guns, if the RN are feeling reasonably comfortable with that current state of world events, or some combination of 4 twin or 3 triple 18-inch guns if the RN want to make a statement. If they really want to make a statement, I could see 4 triple 18-inch guns being a possibility, but that would need a world very on edge to justify the size and cost of that class of ships, plus a huge investment in infrastructure. You could get there, but honestly, sheesh, think about it. 12 18-inch guns. Yowza. Sorry, I just had a mental thought of what 16 18-inch guns would be like in 4 quadruple turrets. Colin Cameron, Doc, I think you may get 3 new ship designs post-Channel Whiteheart. First, whilst infrastructure is being expanded home and abroad for larger ships, I could see a new form of Channel coastal defence ship being built with 2 triple 18-inch turrets front and back, speed between 24 and 26 knots and heavily armoured. Also, depending on how many ships from the battle had managed to beach, I could see them being given quite a bit of reserve buoyancy, probably through bulges. The second design I could see would be what would class a fast battleship to replace the battlecruisers with three triple 18-inch gun again, well armored at speed to match the historical Hood at around 32 knots. Third design I could see would be a new dreadnought with either four triple 18 or four triple 20-inch guns, massively heavy armored, design speed of about 28 knots. Liz Stewart, books are much more expensive than social life. I'm told Warhammer is worse, and deciding that I might need a new core tabletop system is up there. That could be fun. Yeah. Miss ZZ, I don't trust people who can't slice bread to make sandwiches. Technically, I can slice bread to make sandwiches, and my mum does it a lot better and has tried to teach me. And she always managed to slice it perfectly, and perfectly straight, and can do really thin slice. I can get closest to medium cutting. But if I can get a machine to slice the bread for me, so I don't have to, I am just about lazy enough on that front to let it go and let it happen. Abaron 13, to answer your question, Doctor, I think the Dreadnought force of the RM would be made up of modified, modernised Queen Elizabeths and N3s, replacing ours as they became available. The R's being relegated to second line of service or sole donated to Dominion navies. I don't see a lot of difference in the post-war geopolitical landscape for Britain being between the historical scenario and the one you presented. Before both end with their main rival naval power thoroughly defanged by way of channel battle or scuttling the Scarborough Flow. Once the two-power standard has been reasserted, I expect that we see gun size creeping up, tit for tat, ship classes up to 18-inch and maybe up to 20-inch. I'm more interested to see how battlecruisers develop in this space. If the war ends as you described and there is a handover of colonies by Germany, I'd say that Britain would pick up most of them, having done most of the fighting. This would make priority number 2, after building ground fleet, expansion of colonial and trade protection capabilities. I'm curious how this would affect the science for Hood and successors, especially since a short war wouldn't allow the value and utility of aircraft submarines to be fully demonstrated. I'm concerned about leadership of the RN though. As evidenced in World War II, it has no shortage of capable losses, but if the leadership of the main forces around Britain are all dead, so much experience in institutional memory died in the Channel. Interesting enough, Admirals Trowbridge and Craddock might well be there, so the RN might not be in bad form, and Fisher would still be alive, and the consummate professional Prince Louis of Battenberg would still be First Sea Lord. So I don't think the RN would be badly situated. Interesting enough, they might end up approaching aircraft as a force maximization methodology, because remember, the Royal Naval Air Service has already been established by this point. New Akira 472. This hypothetical sounds like the Battle of Tsushima, but with more equal forces in the Channel. That was pretty much what I was going through. Gilbert, the other one. Dr. Clark, thanks for the video. It was very informing and interesting. There is a somewhat related what-if scenario I've been thinking about recently, and which you briefly touched on aspects here. I was curious if I could get your thoughts on it. The explanation provided for the breakdown of the Anglo-German relations at the beginning of the 20th century is generally something along the lines of Germany's major naval build-up and or colonial ambitions, and the subsequent naval race caused Britain to switch from viewing Germany as a friendly neutral power to a potential threat hostile power. That line of thinking would imply that if the German Navy didn't attempt a major naval expansion, that would upset the two-power sun and Britain's naval dominance, presumably from Wilhelm II either not being on the throne or having not fired Bismarck, then by extension Anglo-German relations would not have deteriorated. Is that accurate, or were there other factors already driving a wedge between the countries and the arms race just accelerated the split? It's pretty much on the ball, because there is a very strong Anglo-German relationship already. If Germany doesn't have a navy, yes, they're their economic contenders, but if they're not building up the high seas fleets, they're just maintaining ships which they have for their own defence, then frankly Britain considers them economic rivals, and they probably have a friendly liner race still, but probably they stay as friends. In which case, you could end up with a scenario, especially considering the Russo-British relations, of the alliance being Germany, Britain, Austro-Hungary and Italy versus France and Russia. And Japan. So Britain, Germany, Austro-Hungary, Italy and Japan versus France and Russia. Which would be an interesting World War One if it ended up being a World War One, if similar incidents played out, but that scenario took place. Because, let's be honest, the Italian Navy backed by the Mediterranean Fleet and the Austro-Hungarian Fleet would have a great deal of fun with the French fleet in the Mediterranean. The British would quickly deal with the French and the rest of the world, and the Russians. And yes, whilst then if you had, well, you could have this plan, the plan I've talked about, take place where the Royal Navy transports the German army along with the BEF to invade France, and that would definitely put a different spin on the whole amphibious operation to go around Belgium. And Russia as well. And you could end up with all sorts of things, like a whole section of Russia ended up being carved off and given to Japan at the end of the war, because Japan would invade Russia from the west, from the east, and yeah, it could be a very interesting scenario as to what might happen. In regards to post-Channel battleship designs, one thing to consider is that if the defining only naval engagement of the war were fought at such short ranges, then the development of technology and doctrines related to long-range gunnery that occurred during and after World War I probably would have been greatly slowed. This could have had all sorts of knock effects on ship design in terms of arms schemes to balance the gun, velocity, penetration, barrel life, the role torpedoes in Fleet Battles Act. Agreed, but I would actually say I think the reverse. I think if you have such a devastating short-range battle, people will be even keen on having a longer range battles in future, and avoiding such short-range things. One interesting scenario which no one actually picked up, and I would actually go into, is whether or not battleships and battle cruisers ended up reverting to their earlier pre-dreadnought form in having torpedo boats. I think they were originally usually classified as second or third class torpedo boats. Actually, it's part of their boats aboard their ship. I think they could. I think they could end up with launching a little sort of slip out the back and the ability to launch and recover these boats from the stern, because I think that could be seen as a crucial thing for such battles if you're going to try and extend range of fighting. It's interesting. Anyway, thank you very much for the questions. Hope you enjoyed the response. Thank you for all of them. Even ones which called me amateurish. Sorry, Adam, but that phrase didn't gel well with me, especially when you then added on I was being uncharitable on purpose. That just... disagreeing is one thing, insulting is another. But thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.